Next, first thing that I want to go through when we jump into this contribution model is actually a recap from the last episode where we talked a lot about documentation. We'll just quickly go over that and we'll provide you a link to that one as well in the chat. The next thing, though, is that we want to go through the contribution ABCs, or the format that we're going to go through for this one is the CBAs. Following that, we'll jump into the AMA. So please, again, ask those questions in the Q&A section. It does not have to be about contribution, really open to any topic, anything related to design systems. All right, quick little episode 4 recap here. So last episode, we went and talked through some actual documentation best practices. These are things like documenting things like accessibility requirements or how to actually consume these particular components. Best practices for whether like when you should use certain icons, when you shouldn't, how to consume components, code examples, that sort of thing. There's a ton of stuff inside of there. I'm going to highly recommend you actually go and check out that other episode that we did if you're curious on more best practices for documentation. The next thing we talked about there was where documentation should live. And we'll be tying into this a little bit during this episode today, but there's a big scale of how you should actually position documentation in your system, from at the very start, just having it in line with all of your components themselves, all the way going towards a more custom solution that's purpose-built for documentation. All that content is not only available on YouTube, but we also have the slides for that available on the Figma community, which we're going to toss a link to in the chat over there. Thanks, Chad. So go through, take a look at that. There's some good tips in there for where you should position your documentation. Okay, let's go through these CBAs. The first one is this contribution process that's there. And when we're talking about the contribution process, what we want to talk about is whether it's a formal or an informal process that we support. It really doesn't matter which of these you're actually going for, but the important thing is that you're setting those expectations for the team itself, and not just the design systems team, but all of the designers in your company. That said, there are a few things that I highly recommend here. And that is when you're starting out and going from a small team, moving towards a large team over here, you also want to go from less formality to more formality in your contribution process that's there. So try and actually match those things together. Really, the other major reason why you want this actual more formal process, or even a less formal one, but just a documented process, is that a lack of a clear contribution model for your designers will result in you actually having fractured, smaller design systems that break off from your design system, which are going to become a lot more problematic as you grow even more as a company. Chad's going to talk to us next about setting boundaries, though, for these actual contributions as well.
Yeah, and that's a great thing, right? On what goes into your process and boundaries, because should everything live in the design system, or should some things live with the product team? And really, not everything needs to be a part of the design system. And I say that with the caveat of right now, or maybe ever. What I mean by this is sometimes things in the design system, things might get contributed or built out that are only used by one entity. One team uses it or one product uses it. And it's so tightly coupled to their individual use case that it doesn't really benefit other users of the system. So should that live in the design system, or should that kind of be its own little kind of like Snowflake system that lives with the product team? And a great way to think about this when you're thinking about your contribution process for your design system is, I found in the past to use a model kind of like this, where you can start to think about contributions on, is this something we should consider including in the design system? Or should we recommend that a product team continues to own this and that it lives within their particular realm? Really starting out with just, hey, we're using the design system to build something, and we've run into a use case that I don't think there's anything that exists in the system to help us solve this. Kind of a good starting question is, hey, is there something similar in the system that can be used? And if there is, and it's like, oh, yeah, maybe if I just think about this flow a little differently, or maybe use this, yeah, this totally works. All right, cool. Just use the existing asset. You're good to just carry on. But if there is something, maybe it's a little bit similar and it doesn't still meet the use case, you can kind of ask, could we potentially update this? Either the design system team, can we update this? Or, you as the product team, you have a lot more context on this use case. Would this be something you could potentially contribute back to as an expansion of this particular component or established pattern? If it can, cool, let's bring it into the design system. If not, it's still very tightly coupled. Maybe you should continue to own that. And then just overall, a great filter for setting a boundary. If you are a maintainer of your design system, just a good first question is, could this potentially be used by multiple teams? Is there a benefit of this being able to be used and adapted for multiple cases? If the answer is yes, it probably makes sense to consider including that in the design system. But of course, snowflakes, they are okay. And so let's talk a little bit about, there should still be a process around snowflakes living with a particular product team. And one of the big differences there is that, it's all completely crafted and maintained by an individual or by a team. The design system team doesn't tend to build this out. It is built by that individual team. That said, it should still utilize core assets from the design system, so that way it still feels connected and cohesive. So using those color styles, any types, spacing rules, if you're building out a reusable pattern that is built upon existing components from the design system, continue to use those. Don't just like build a brand new button from scratch and include it in there. Use the existing buttons from the system in whatever you're building. That brings to the point where, snowflakes, it should still feel cohesive, but it may be a little bit inconsistent with the other assets from the library. And I know that sometimes this can be like, no, it needs to be consistent. Yeah, it can be a little inconsistent. It's okay. It might be slightly different. The more important part is it should still feel like a cohesive, connected piece, while it may have a little bit of variance. And the reason I say that is because it may be adopted into the design system in the future. Thinking about things where maybe you've built something that is very unique to a particularly maybe pricing model, and you're building that out. Well, then you end up releasing another product or something else with different pricing stuff and kind of determine, hey, I see that this team built this. We could potentially use it as well. Another team gets on board. It may make sense for the design system team to then adopt that snowflake into the design system. And as a part of adopting it into the design system as the contribution, whether it's from scratch or it's a snowflake being contributed into the design system, that's where you really need to watch that it isn't tied to a specific feature use, and it can benefit multiple, teams, multiple products, multiple mediums, whatever entity you want to describe that as. And making sure that it follows the consistent behaviors, patterns, the established guidelines for the design system, making sure that everything fits and feels like it's a part of it. The other piece is not to just contribute in a silo, have an open conversation with the design system team. Hey, Jacob, I've got this awesome idea. I think this could be really great to contribute. Would love to get your thoughts. Let me throw something together. Do you think that this would make sense? And then the biggest piece is once it is brought into the design system, it's going to be maintained by the design system team after that initial contribution. So that's why it's really important to have that open conversation to make sure that there's the understanding of what the intent is behind this contribution and then how it will continue to live on in the system.
Totally. All great points there. And one of the things that I really like that you mentioned, Chad, is you said make sure you're not operating in a silo. And this is a really important part because I think it's easy to silo people out in two separate ways. The first is siloing them out through just like rules and regulations that are there, being like, no, we're closed off, design system, no one allowed to the party. And the other is closing people off from just like an excitement point where you're just like, no, no, we are high and mighty in design systems team, and you are lowly designers. You must respect what we give you. Be open about these things. Be excited about things that people are sharing back to your design systems team. Really encourage those teams as they're going out there and they're sharing their cool stuff, and talk and work with them and be like, hey, well, what about this? What about this? Here's how we can make this a little bit better and more in line with the system. As you're engaging with those designers, they're going to become more comfortable with actually contributing back into the design system itself. And they'll be more receptive when you had things like contribution guidelines in line with your actual code components or your components themselves. Using those inline docs is a great way to start with this, just so they know like an area where they can even post the things that they've been working on. And I'd also recommend really, again, going through and looking at the documentation episode that we did here for other ways where you can surface these guidelines, as well as surface ways where people can actually show off their work and get excited about it. So yeah, be clear about that entire process that's there. All right, speaking of processes, next Chad is going to walk us through a certain process, which is our B, I believe.
Yeah. And before I do that, just one thing that, I love that you said in here, Jacob, is, about the encouraging teams to share their cool stuff, right? That's one of the key ways that your design system will continue to evolve, is by the folks who are using it. They're the ones who are going to help you continue to evolve it and really make that system a reflection of all of the users. So, definitely it's not just about drawing the rectangles and hitting the publish button. A lot of it is also about that relationship building side of it, having the open dialogue with the consumers of the system and encouraging them to contribute back to it. So love that call out in there. All right, so let's talk about the B. And for B, we're going to say B is for branching. And what I mean by this is not only just in Figma as the branching feature in Figma, but also if we just think about the development side of things and branching. Most often when developers are going to do work on an existing component or make a contribution in, they're going to create a branch off of the code base, and they're going to do all of their work there, submit a PR for it, eventually merge it in. Well, we can do similar in Figma, and we can adopt some of those same Git I can't talk this morning. Git processes. We'll just say that because I can't talk this morning. Of branching, forking, different models we can also adopt on the design side of things. So a couple of ways that you can do your contributions within your Figma libraries. One is to use branching to contribute to the library. So it's very, very similar model to development changes. And the great thing is it doesn't disrupt the source of truth. So, we've talked about in previous episodes, if you're going to make updates to your components, you're probably not going to want to do it right in the main file, because if people are coming into that file and they see things that look different than what's published, it may be confusing. There's chances they might copy a piece out of the library that's in flight and start using it in their files when it's not intended to. So you don't really want to disrupt that source of truth when you are making a contribution and editing in the main file. But also in Figma, branching offers a more formal review process with the review states. So you can actually request feedback and have folks comment. This is great for contributions because we can go ahead and create a branch, make some recommendations, and then request feedback from the design system team. And the other great thing about using branching is that you can always reference back in branch history to see what's been merged in, what's been archived, and maybe picked back up later. It's very easy to reference back to past contributions. Now, one thing with branching, this is only available on Oregon Enterprise in Figma. And I'm going to show a little bit about how we do a contribution with branching. So let's take a look here. I'm going to jump into my file here where we can see that I can go into our design system team here, and I can take a look at the component library. And I've got the buttons here, or maybe, yeah, let's do the button here. Maybe I want to make a recommendation to contribute to the library here that I want to add another button type. Well, since I'm not a part of the design system team, I can't just edit this library, but I can still see it. Since I'm an editor somewhere else within the organization, I can go up and create a branch. And I usually like to recommend to teams, if you're going to make a contribution, prefix your branch with something indicating it's a contribution. And I'll just call this new button type. So now I have my own workspace of a library here that I can completely edit. So if I go take a look here and we see the button, and maybe I want to put a new type in here, I'm just going to add a new variant to it. I'm not going to worry about making this look nice for now. Oh, I got to leave it in the component set though. So I'm going to do this new button, and maybe I want to make this a yellow button. I'm going to just not use my colors here, and I'm going to add this kind of button type here. And maybe I also want to make a recommendation for all of our buttons that we make them, maybe our primaries are all a little bit larger. They're 48 pixels right now. I'm going to bump that up to 56. And maybe this is going to be my recommendation of what I want to contribute into the system. Now, I should also consider what the hover state would be for it and what the press state would be. For the sake of our time today, I'm not going to do that. But what I can do now is, once I'm ready to say, hey, I want to make this contribution, I can go in here and review the changes. And now here I can see what I've changed, what was there before, what I am now going to recommend we add into it. And here I can request a review. It's already going to show me some folks who are editors on the team. I'm going to add Tom to it. I can also bring in additional reviewers. I'm going to request Clara as well. And I'm going to request a review on this. And it's going to bring up a dialogue for me to say, hey, what is the context for these changes? I'd like to contribute a new warning button type. Now, I can add a lot more context to it, but essentially this will send a notification to Tom and Clara, who work on the design system team, to take a look at this branch and see if it's something we should consider merging in to our library. This is, of course, just the beginning part of the process. Obviously, then there's the whole other side on if this is accepted, what it looks like in communication with the development team, how this is going to get built out. So it's not saying once it's merged in that, hey, it's done, it lives. There is a lot more to the process involved. Now, the other method that I mentioned at the beginning there was, if we think about, well, maybe I don't have branching, I'm not on the org or enterprise plan with Figma, but I still want a way to contribute. We could kind of adopt the thought process behind forking. And this can be great if you're going to spin up, a completely new idea. Maybe you want to duplicate the library to your drafts, or maybe you want to just use the component and you want to detach it. You just want to detach things, break it, explore, and iterate. This is where you will use comments to have conversation with the design system team. Also, we see this a lot where if you might be maybe a smaller organization, utilize the person-to-person conversation, have a conversation with the folks on your design system team to talk about it. And if the change is going to be accepted in, the design system team will make those changes to the library and then push those updates out. So let's take a look at what this looks like to do that kind of forking detach method. Let's let chaos ensue and let's break it all. So I'm going to switch back over here. Pardon me. And I'm going to take a look at two ways I can do this. One would be to go into the components. And if I wouldn't have the branching ability, I could duplicate this library to my drafts. And now once I duplicate the library, even though I'm a viewer on it, this is now an isolated copy in my drafts. It's essentially a fork of the library. And in my drafts here, I could do the same thing where, we'll use the button as an example again. Maybe I want to add that warning button to it. So I can go ahead and do this here. I'm going to change this out for, I'm just going to grab different colors. Perfect. I've created this warning button. It's still a part of it, but I don't have a way to share this back directly into the library. What I could do at this point is I could share this file and I could share this with someone who is a part of that team. So I could share it with Tom again. I could share it with Clara. And then I could have them come into it. And I could also do it via comments. So if I press C and I leave a comment, and I could also just tag them here. So I could still do it this way as well. This is where it's going to be a bit more manual process for the design system team, where if they decide, yeah, we're going to include this, they would need to either do this work in the library itself. They may be able to copy and paste it into the library. This is really the cleanest way of doing it if you're making a change. Now, if you're doing something that's net new, that's even easier. You can just work on a file in your drafts. You maybe have like a scratch pad. You're going to start designing something from scratch. I'm just going to do a label, add some auto layout to it here. And I'll give that a red fill. So I might just start to build this, and I might not even make a component. I might do the same thing where I use a comment or share and say, I'd like to build this new piece into the system. I can absolutely do it this way. The other way I can also do it is if I'm going to detach things and break it. So let's say I'm going to take a notification here. We'll take our toast. And here I want to go in and make a change to it. I can hit Command Option B and detach it. So now I'm just working in my scratch pad here, so I can tear this apart, do whatever I want to it. Maybe I want to make some crazy decisions here. I want to make the icon be green. I want to make it very, very cool looking. But I could do the comment method again. I can share this scratch pad. And again, these are ways that I could still make contributions to the team, just doing it in a little bit more manual forking type process. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing here and I'm going to toss it back over to Jacob. Actually, Jacob, do you want me to just share the next one as well? I can do that.
No, I got this.
All
Let's
right.
jump into the next kind of stage in this of our CBAs, which is the A section, really our architecture of these components themselves. And one important thing with this as well is making sure that that architecture is receptive to updates as we're actually engineering these things in our design systems. So a lot of this is also focusing on the update management aspect of these components that are there. One way we can actually really guarantee that all of these items are really done in a cohesive and really appropriate way for a design system is by using a contribution checklist. Chad has gone through and actually made a really, really good template for this. It's up on the community, and we're going to post a link in the chat right now. And includes things such as checking to make sure your contrast ratios are okay before you push out those updates. Or are your layers named correctly and according to the guidelines that you have for your design systems? Really curious though, if we can actually guess and think of other things that we can actually add into a contribution template that's here. So if you have things that you would check for before publishing, post them in the chat. We're curious to see if you can capture some of these. And I'll give people 30 seconds to post the things that you should check for in the chat. Drew's talking about auto layout, absolutely making sure that your actual spacings of that auto layout are correct, especially for the guidelines that you've set out. Accessibility, definitely a really important one that's there, making sure that not only is the text legible and the contrast ratios are there, but that it's also compliant with your actual content design guidelines for accessibility as well. Yeah, spelling, color blindness, the pixel perfectness, Tegan, that's definitely a good one you want to call out, is making sure that the design itself actually looks good. Yeah, ordering of elements to be read by a screen reader, definitely an element that's there that's going to be important for that accessibility. And yeah, the grids and spacings, all those things for sure.
Proper layer naming, absolutely. If it's being added into a contribution to the design system, typically in a component for the system, it's important to have the layer namings, the layer's name describing what's happening. Frame 1247 isn't necessarily as helpful when it's in a component coming from the library.
Yeah, all great things that are in there. Again, if you're curious to look for a more in-depth one, please check out this community file. It's a great starting point for any of these things. Part of this as well, though, is using a test-driven process inside of your design system as well. This is something we can really learn from our engineering kind of co-partners that are out there, because they develop some really amazing processes for dealing with large changes that are super complex. One interesting thing that I didn't realize until I joined Figma is that there's actually ways to engineer components so that there's no right answer for how those actual overrides should be transferred between the previous version and the updated version. And so here at Figma, there's often times where there's no way we can 100% of the time transfer those overrides, especially if you've architected one of those scenarios. So one thing we really highly recommend is to test all of your updates before rolling them out to your users that are out there. Because as the complexity of this library grows, so will those issues that present themselves. One way that I really like to actually approach this is actually by using test pages. Test pages are a great way to catch any sort of thing that's going wrong with the updates ahead of time. The way that I do this is I create a few instances of my components themselves with select overrides. And then I create a copy of each of those as control and detach them. This means when I update my actual master component itself, those control ones shouldn't update because they're detached from the actual instance itself. The last thing I like to do is actually add in this visual diff that's here. I'm going to show you in demo how this actually works. So I have my slide itself. And if I look and see what's going on here, what I actually have is a few stacked elements and items that are here. So I have a detached control version that's on top of the instance itself. And this detached one has its layer mode set to difference. What this allows me to do is whenever I make any changes to my actual master component here, let's say, for instance, I change the spacing. Immediately what we do is we get feedback and we can see very clearly that the actual instance that we have is different from the control element that's there. But we can go a bit further than this as well. Let's say, for instance, what we do is we're actually taking one of our avatars and we're doing some weird stuff. And what we end up doing is we copy this and maybe we paste one inside of there, but then we delete the original one that's present. Well, when we do that, this is an entirely new layer, which means that we don't know how to transfer those overrides that are there to the new instance. And with the visual diff, we can see immediately that that override did not transfer. It shows up right there in red. And so that's one simple thing you can do when setting up these kind of test cases that are present. That way, when you're creating these updates for your system, it's not the users that are experiencing the things that are broken, it's you catching them much earlier in the process. So you have a much more robust design system that's there. Another thing that I want to talk about is icon updates. Icons are something that we find all the time break, especially when people are swapping between icons. And one of the most common things that we see is that the color that the icon has does not transfer when you swap it out or when you do an update. Number two reasons that are there for this not happening are that the new icons that are there have a different number of layers than the original icon set. And we always recommend for that any sort of icons that are out there, you flatten those layers as much as possible into one single unified just vector path. The next thing though is that the layer names do not match. We transfer overrides based a lot on naming, as well as based on layer IDs. But the names are an important and easy way to make sure that if they're aligned, those overrides will transfer correctly. That way, as you're swapping between these things, you have a much more consistent experience within your system. The last thing that I'm going to talk about here is don't be afraid to roll out a V2 of your design system. At some point in time, everyone will go through this, and there will be a time where you want to completely reimagine your design system and re-architect not only the visual look, but everything under the hood as well. That's a great time to roll from a V1 of your library to a brand new file and start in an entirely new V2. This will guarantee that while there won't be an actual easy upgrade path that's there, at the very least, you'll guarantee that as people are consuming that V2, they won't be breaking any of their old usage of that V1 library that's out there. And at some point, this becomes required for those large architectural changes that are there. All right, now we want to jump into our Q&A section of the actual building blocks. I hope you found a lot of that really sensible for what we were talking about regarding the contribution process that's there. Now, though, we want to answer some of your questions. So please, if you have initial questions, toss them in that Q&A section right there. We're going to start going through these. Do not keep them constrained to just contribution processes. It's anything design systems related. We're happy to answer it.
Yes. And with that, first question here from Andrew, is it possible to add the status of checks for the review process as code checks on CI when developing the code?
This is a great question, and something we find that we encounter a lot when we're talking about really rich teams that have a lot of process involved in their actual system. At the moment, there's no native way to do this inside of Figma. That said, in the previous episode, one thing we talked about was adding status checks in your documentation itself in the file next to the components that were there. And there's some patterns that we went through and walked through when we were actually talking about how to do that. And it's a very easy way to just create, say, like a variant that's there of different states of where something is in that CI process. So designers can easily switch and say, hey, this is in review, this is just started, this is done, this is ready to go and ready to be merged, that sort of thing. Whatever processes you have and whatever states you need, it's super easy to add as a variant and just swap between those whenever you're going through the review itself.
Awesome. How do you manage margins in components? Yeah, so I think a lot of this, the way I personally approach this is using auto layout. And in auto layout, you kind of get into like padding and then spacing of things. A great starting point, I always recommend the auto layout playground file in the Figma community. That's a great place to get started with using auto layout. And it really translates over into components as well. As far as like margins outside of it, that's also something that it can live in the documentation if it needs to. I've seen some teams do it where they'll use spacer components as a part of their components as well, that then they turn on or off either via layer visibility or using a layer component property for the Boolean to turn the spacers on and off. I've seen folks start to do that as well. But a couple ways that you can do that for having the margins in there.
All right, next one that we have here is, do you have any comments related to create a system for content such as labels, product names, translations, etc.? Man, this is a hard one in that really creating a system that's out there for content designers is a really hard thing that I don't think we've solved in a really great way inside of Figma. That said, I have seen a few teams do this really successfully in the past. A lot of it is actually by relying on some plugins as well. And one that I'll actually call out here is Ditto, is a great one that I've found for any sort of content design. Chad, do you have any recommendations that you'd make here for doing it natively inside of Figma though?
Yeah, and again, you summed this up. We haven't seen a ton of great ways. Ditto and Google Sheet Sync are two of the most common plugins that I've seen teams use. Another approach that I have seen some teams do is they'll actually create content components, and the content team will manage those components. And then designers can use those for when they're building out screens. They'll drop in, okay, I need, an article here, or I need a product detail written here, or, they use the component type. So then when the content teams come into it, it's already a part of the layout. They just need to override the text in the instances for it. One that's actually coming to mind, if you reference back on the Figma YouTube channel to the talks from Config this year, back in May, there's a talk, the name of the exact talk is escaping me, but it's specifically about UX copy teams. Romain gave a great talk about how they have UX copy working with their design system teams, and they actually show a little bit about the components for text. And I can find that link as well.
I think Vanessa beat you to it.
Yeah. How do you track dependencies between other components that may be affected by a branch or fork? For example, an atom change could impact a molecule and organism, their parent. Great question, Drew. So a few different ways of approaching this. We actually, I think, Jacob, we kind of showed an example of this in the last documentation episode as well, right? There's a few ways that I've seen teams do this. One, they might just have a sticker sheet existing in their library as well. If it's a smaller library, they may have it right there so they can see if they're updating a component, what gets changed and all of the different variants for it. I've also seen teams do it where they will have a separate file that has examples of everything. One thing I've done in the past is grab a screen from multiple different teams that use the library and just keep those compiled in like a test file for myself. So that way, when I go to publish a change, I can quickly jump into that file and see if I've broken everything. And if so, I can undo that publish by restoring the previous version, publish it, make my changes, move forward. That's one way I've seen it approached as well. Also, if you are making changes in a branch, there is kind of a workaround of duplicating your branch to a new file, publishing it, testing it like this. I actually put out a Figma tip on the Figma Tips YouTube playlist about how to test your changes from a branch.
All right, the next question that we have is, should we be using base components? It's present in Figma's support documentation, last I checked, but with many of the most recent releases, it seems like Figma is moving away from this practice. Drew, you are right on the money. We are trying to move as much as possible away from base component implementations that are out there. Base components were really a necessity when we only had variants inside of the system. And it was a way to really defeat that combinatoric explosion of variants that were required to support a lot of multidimensional variants that were out there. Now, though, that we have component properties inside of Figma, and especially Boolean properties, which allow you to toggle the visibility of layers through that actual properties panel, we highly recommend moving away from base components. Base components are bad from a user experience standpoint because it requires you to actually configure not only the topmost component that's there, but also that base layer inside of it as well, which would be confusing for designers that are consuming. But the other thing we see is that there are a lot of issues with transferring overrides when swapping between items that have base components. This gets into what I was talking about earlier around how it's totally a way that you can do where you can architect a situation where there's no correct way to transfer overrides between two things. And we see that a lot happening with base component architectures. So very much recommend no base components, at least on my end. Chad, what do you say?
As someone who has built base components, as someone who's moved away from base components, as someone who experimented with, are there use cases for it? Overall, there's not a ton of great uses for base components anymore that I've found. The big piece is optimizing your system and your libraries for your consumers of it. Jacob, you hit it right on the head on so many of the things that are like difficult. They make the job of the maintainer of the library a lot easier, but at the cost of the consumption experience. And I would rather take more work on as the maintainer to provide a better experience for the consumers of it. That said, there are still uses for local components, not using and I do like how Drew, you captured it as the base in quotes there. Using it as a base component, cramming in every single configuration, not a great idea, anymore. Using a local component that's not published on the library, that's just something specific to another part of a component published, there are still absolutely use cases for that.
Yeah, solid call-outs there, Chad, as well. Okay, Anonymous asks, can you repeat the visual diff bit again? I'm totally happy to demo that again, and I'll walk you through how I actually created that as well as showing that off. Here, let me steal the presentation for a sec here, Chad, and I'm going to go to my editor.
The comments while you were doing that, Jacob, was just like mind blown. Like such a great tip.
Into that trick. Okay, so we have our little page that's here, and I'm going to do this all from the start. So I have this actual component that's here with just a profile and a name. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a copy of it first. So I just have my instance over here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. So just Command C, and then I paste it again. So now I actually have two of these that are overlaid on top of each other. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the top one that's there. I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to detach this instance. So now I have my control element, which won't be updated when I change the actual master component itself, and an instance that's underneath it. With the overlaid control component that's there, I'm going to go to the layer blending modes that are down here, and I'm going to select the blending mode of difference. And what difference does is it compares the pixels that are below it with the current pixels that this has. And if they are the same, it renders black. If they are completely different, it renders white. And so what we can see right here is because there's no changes that are present, this renders as black. However, when I now change my actual master component itself and change, say, the spacing, what I can see immediately is changes inside of here by using this difference mode as a visual diff between these two things. Hopefully that makes sense for the architecture that's there. With this one, I went a little bit fancier. I actually set a layer on top of it. And this layer is actually just like a rectangle with red on it. And I have it set to darken. That way, when I make these changes, it shows up in like very warning-ish red that's there. It's just a little bit of added piece of polish that I like to add to these type of things.
Yeah, that is such a great tip. All right. So let's see. Any idea on when we'll be able to pin projects to the top of the list in a team?
So one thing that I would say one thing I'll call out here is these are great suggestions that we're always looking for any sort of user and designer that's out there.
Mhm.
Much like how you should have a contribution process for your actual design systems, we definitely have a place to actually make these suggestions that are there. Check out our actual forum.figma.com, which Vanessa has very helpfully just posted inside of here. And I think there is a suggestion idea section inside of there that this would be super helpful for us product managers over here at Figma to get this input from you to know that this is something that you really want and value, and to let the community vote on these things as well so they can surface the ones at the top that people really, really need.
Awesome. Is there a way to move a private file to a library branch? So you could move the contents of the file. So if you're creating a branch in the library and you have your own file, you can hit Command A to select all, and then just Command V to paste it into the branch. So you can go that way. If there are, if the file is multiple pages and you're looking to bring stuff over, you could do that by, in your branch, creating each of the pages and then just copy pasting things right over.
All right, how would you proceed with withdrawing and replacing certain obsolete and possibly badly designed design elements from DS in a rather big organization? Would you even consider doing this? One thing I like to do with these type of things is actually go through a few separate stages of this process if I'm removing something from the design system. The first stage that I like to do is what I will do is just like adding in the description of this component. I'll just put deprecated with a big kind of warning sign that's there, so that whenever anybody inserts that actual element into their files, they know that this is something that we are looking to deprecate. I'll let that bake for a couple of months so people can kind of get used to that. And if you are on the org or higher tier, one thing you could do is you can use the actual DS analytics to see if the trend of usage of that is going downwards. If it isn't, then you can go even a little bit more extreme, which is actually adding in just a big little like deprecated text element on top of that. And then they'll have to use it in a detached state, which adds just a little bit more friction there. And then later on, we'll go so far as to actually remove that from the DS itself, possibly keeping it inside of a previous version of the library. So if they really, really need it, they can go and enable like a DS deprecated library, for instance, and consume it that way. Chad, any other things that you would add to that?
Yeah, that's, really the biggest piece I've found in doing this is just making sure you have that plan up front before you do it. So much of it does rely on a plan and communication. Even pulling inspiration from how do the development teams deprecate components or deprecate features. Are there things that can be borrowed that are already ingrained within the organization's culture on deprecation models? Can you apply that to your library as well? I think this also, sometimes, withdrawing and replacing, as Jacob mentioned earlier in the presentation, don't be afraid of the V2. Sometimes it can be, we might just want to leave this and re-architect this in a V2 that we eventually move everything over to. Something else that Jacob was mentioning, I also recommend doing this at least annually. Audit your design system, find out what are the things that aren't being used. Is there a reason they're not being used? Or if they are being used, are they all being detached in your library assets? On the code side, are people just overriding everything and doing things manually? Great things to look at and then see, do we just need to not maintain this anymore, deprecate it, or do we just need to re-architect this and maybe move to a V2? I think we got time for maybe one or two more here.
Yes, this one is migrating a few components to component properties has been difficult due to the unpredictability in how the instances will react to change. If none of the component, if you've removed some of the component variants is what I'm assuming this is asking. Is there a process we can use to do this without breaking our designs? This is a great question, and it's something that you're going to encounter for sure if you're removing variants that are there from the original component set. And that's why I was saying earlier, this is number one, something you want to actually test those actual implementations with. But number two as well, this is a situation where you may consider the re-architecture to be large enough that you would consider moving to a V2 of the library that's there. Whenever you're removing those other variant states that are there, it becomes really tricky to support some of these things, especially as you're kind of completely pulling those out, and then the component has to update to the actual base default version of the variants that are there, and then they have to switch over to using the actual properties to control it. Chad, do you have any other tips that you'd recommend for this migration and this update process? Because I know you've done a lot of work on this as well.
Yeah. And I would actually also recommend checking out the office hours that we had done for component properties. This question is fantastic because we do talk a bit about this in the office hours. A couple of things you can also do is lean on the analytics to see which are the most used variants that you currently have. And it's usually a good idea to make those changes to those most used components, because that's going to have I'll quote, the least amount of breaking in that. Now, the big thing is, it is a breaking change depending on how you've architected your components. So just like even deprecating or migrating, having that plan in place is really what's going to be key there. But I would definitely check out that office hours. Vanessa posted the link there. We do talk a bit about this and some tips for planning migration.
Totally. I think we got time for one more here. Oh, nope. We're going to end up.
You want to take one more? All right, well, let's take one more.
We can do one more. Why not?
Yeah.
Can you speak to challenges that occur in dealing with multiple branch conflicts? How do you manage when to merge and when other branches might be affected? Chad, I'm actually going to hand this to you.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a great one to take as a last minute one.
Yeah, this is a long one that's there.
Yeah, this is one where it's like a demo is usually probably more appropriate for this one, which I don't have anything set up for that I can show right now. Kind of the short answer to this is thinking about not even branches, but when you are working in a file with multiplayer and edits are happening, the way that Figma updates that is whoever made the last update is what is now reflected. Branching is kind of the same thing, not just in Figma, but also in code, right? Whatever gets merged is now what's in main is now what is the main thing. So if you merge in a branch, it's now saying, hey, this is now the latest. It's going to prompt every other branch that's still out there that there are updates from main. Now, sometimes it may not even affect what's happening in the other branches. The same layers aren't being edited. So it can say, you don't have any conflicts. The updates are optional. But there can be times that things got merged that are touching the exact same layers that you're working on in another branch. That's where you would then have to choose, do you keep the work that's happening in the branch and that's going to be the new main, or do you bring in the changes and it's potentially going to overwrite what you've already done? It's kind of one of those you need to just approach it similar to even if you're doing it on code and decide what you're going to keep versus not. It's just a kind of a process there. We do have a couple of office hours about branching, like diving deeper into branching, where we talk a little about this. There's also, I believe we've done a couple of tutorial videos out there as well with product education. That can also help for some of the stuff on managing merge conflicts. So great questions all. I know we couldn't get to all of them today, but a couple places you can connect. If you do have questions and unsure of things, you can always check out help.figma.com, also forum.figma.com. Jacob mentioned that before. You can get help and support from folks in the community there, from Figma folks, also sharing your product ideas. We love to hear from the community, and so much of what gets built into Figma comes from the community feedback. So please share your feedback and your ideas. And then of course, also friends.figma.com. You can learn about our Friends of Figma groups all around the world. Join the Friends of Figma Discord if you haven't. You can always chime in for conversation there as well.
One thing that I'll call out here is not only do we have a bunch of events that are here at figma.com/events, but also I do want to plug a few things while we're actually talking about certain events. First and foremost, we have another episode of Building Blocks that'll be coming up next month, which is going to be super exciting because, Chad, are we going to be talking about a super secret new feature that is yet to be released in the next Building Blocks? I think we are.
Maybe I didn't get that memo. Are we?
Oh, you didn't get that memo? Well, that's because it's
No.
super secret. But if we stay and actually listen to that next one, maybe we'll get a cool few demos of what that actually is. In addition, we will be looking to do a full Q&A session sometime in December around design systems. Today, we only got to about 30% of the questions that are there because there are just so many that were being asked. We do want to actually provide a platform for you to support that. We realize that's a few months away. It's because we have got a bunch of other events planned that are going to be super exciting. This session will be recorded on youtube.com/Figma Design. Check out there to actually see any of the recordings of not only this one, but also past episodes of Building Blocks. And if you have suggestions and ideas, please either email us at community@figma.com or post on that Figma forum so that people can vote on it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the great questions and just a great conversation. We always appreciate it.
Alrighty, y'all. Catch y'all next time for the next episode of Building Blocks.